Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to Timeless Testimonies. We're picking up where we left off from last time in Volume 5 of the Testimonies called Nature and Influence of the Testimonies. And we'll be beginning on page 672 in a section called Doubting the Testimonies. But before we get back into it, I just kind of wanted to remind us all of who the testimonies are written for. We need to remember that when Ellen White wrote the testimonies, she wrote them to the believers in present truth of that day. She didn't write testimonies to people outside of the movement, people that didn't believe the same way that they did. She wrote these testimonies to people who professed belief in the Advent message and in her calling as an inspired messenger. And just as a refresher, the very opening statement in this testimony reads like this. As the end draws near and the work of giving the last warning to the world extends, it becomes more important for those who accept present truth to have a clear understanding of the nature and influence of the testimonies, which God in His providence has linked with the work of the third angel's message from its very rise. Now, the reason I wanted to read that again and to remind us who these testimonies are written for is for a couple of reasons. One, just so that we can be thinking introspectively and really asking the important question as to how could this apply to me, and to learn the lesson contained in the testimony. But also for anyone who might be watching this who doesn't believe that Ellen White was an inspired messenger, and they're thinking, yeah, what are you talking about? That doesn't mean anything to me. And I understand that. But this testimony doesn't have any purpose in it to try to explain or prove Ellen White's calling as an inspired message or anything like that. We may have some other videos in the future that touch on that a bit. One of the things, though, that might be helpful for some is that we do have another video on the playlist for this testimony in Volume 5 called To Be Judged by Their Fruits. And in there, it touches on the principle that Jesus spoke of in Matthew chapter 7, verses 15 to 20. It was the parable of the tree and how you would judge by the fruits. A bad tree can't bring forth good fruit, and a good tree can't bring forth bad fruit. And he was using that parable to explain how you could identify false prophets, because he was instructing his disciples to beware of false prophets who come in sheep's clothing, but inside they are ravening wolves. So we are to be able to judge things and people by the message that they bring. And by people, I mean specifically people who claim to have an inspired message. That was the context of what Jesus was discussing. And so that might have something there for people who don't already believe that Ellen White was an inspired messenger. It might be of interest. Again, that video also was not intended to prove that she was an inspired messenger or anything like that. So this testimony, again, is written to people who profess to believe in present truth. And so as we read that, let's just keep that in mind. So here's what she says in Doubting the Testimonies. It is Satan's plan to weaken the faith of God's people in the testimonies. Satan knows how to make his attacks. He works upon minds to excite jealousy and dissatisfaction toward those at the head of the work. The gifts are next questioned. Then, of course, they have but little weight, and instruction given through vision is disregarded. Next follows skepticism in regard to the vital points of our faith, the pillars of our position, then doubt as to the Holy Scriptures, and then the downward march to perdition. When the testimonies which were once believed are doubted and given up, Satan knows the deceived ones will not stop at this. He redoubles his efforts till he launches them into open rebellion, which becomes incurable and ends in destruction. That was taken from Testimonies for the Church, Volume 4, page 211, and Testimonies for the Church, Volume 1, page 236. By giving place to doubts and unbelief in regard to the work of God, and by cherishing feelings of distrust and cruel jealousies, they are preparing themselves for complete deception. They rise up with bitter feelings against the ones who dare to speak of their errors and reprove their sins. That was taken from Testimonies for the Church, Volume 3, page 328. Okay, so in this section, again, she's explaining who she's writing to. She's writing to those who profess to believe that the testimonies were given by God through her writings and through her counsel. It wasn't just written, some of it was verbal too. And so people who profess to believe that, and then they start to doubt and turn away and reject the truth of the reproofs given, typically because it, didn't agree with what they thought about themselves or their ideas and that sort of thing. These are the people that she's writing to and expressing why it's dangerous to be in that position. Now, it's not the same for someone who doesn't know anything about Ellen White's calling or what her message was. Some people may have heard stories about Ellen White and have had people tell them, that she promoted this or that or the other thing, and they might be portraying it in a negative light. But until we have actually read what she wrote and enough of what she wrote to get the overall picture of exactly what the point of her message was really about, we can't make an informed decision about whether she was a true messenger of God or not. So she's not writing to people who haven't gone through all of that and made a stand. These people have made a stand, and then some were starting to express doubt and discontent. You'll notice that one of the things that she describes here is how Satan works upon our minds to get us to be jealous or have disaffection toward those at the head of the work. And disaffection with anyone really is a seed of destruction, because when we have feelings of disaffection toward others, then we will be led to view them in a very negative way, and we'll start to even imagine things that may not even exist in their behavior or in their mode of thinking or motivation and that sort of thing. And so if we find ourselves having these feelings of jealousy or evil surmising or disaffection toward our brethren, that should be a warning sign to us that we're being tempted by the enemy, and then recognizing that there is a temptation, hopefully we'll just decidedly reject it right then. Now, I know that doesn't always happen. So rather than just give into it full force and run further into sin and perdition and that sort of thing, then just keep filling your mind. We should fill our minds with words of truth to combat these temptations and to not allow those feelings of disaffection to grow, to stay and to grow and to manifest into more and more bigger things like that. That's one of the things that the devil uses to try to destroy us and destroy others. Another thing that she's pointing out here that we should really self-examine on is, for those of us who do profess belief in the inspiration of Ellen White, and that her writings contain instruction and counsel from God, we have professed that, and if we then turn away from that because there's something that we don't like, or if we pick and choose portions of what she's written and say, well, but that doesn't really apply to me, or that doesn't apply today, or, we try to work our way around what she really means, we're going to be then doubting the other things that she writes too. And there's nothing wrong with testing a message. We are supposed to test. There would actually be something wrong with not testing a message. But if we've tested the message and we find it to be true and we profess it to be true, and then because there's something that we don't like that ends up coming up, and we decide, oh, well, maybe it's not true after all, that's where doubting really comes in. And that is what will lead to a downward spiral. And where will it stop? I mean, the very words of Jesus. What's to stop us from kind of wiggling our way out of what he said about sin and righteousness, and how, they're just totally polar opposites? We'll start convincing ourselves that it's okay to have a little bit of sin, because it would just be too hard to totally let go of sin and allow God to give us victory over every temptation. These are where the thoughts can lead when we start to give up the belief in something that we have tested and has been shown to us to be true. Now, this last section of what I read is actually an extract from Volume 3 of the Testimonies, and it's a very long testimony. I believe it's called To a Young Minister and His Wife. Yes, To a Young Minister and His Wife. I'm not going to read the whole thing. That would just take way too long. But I would like to read more of the context surrounding that. And then we'll end the video there and pick up with the rest of the part of doubting the testimonies in a subsequent video. But here's what she writes in Volume 3. Never was there greater need of faithful warnings and reproofs and close, straight dealing than at this very time. Satan has come down with great power, knowing that his time is short. He is flooding the world with pleasing fables, and the people of God love to have smooth things spoken to them. Sin and iniquity are not abhorred. I was shown that God's people must make more firm, determined efforts to press back the incoming darkness. The close work of the Spirit of God is needed now as never before. Stupidity must be shaken off. We must arouse from the lethargy that will prove our destruction unless we resist it. Satan has a powerful, controlling influence upon minds. Preachers and people are in danger of being found upon the side of the powers of darkness. There is no such thing now as a neutral position. We are all decidedly for the right or decidedly with the wrong. Said Christ, "He that is not with me is against me, and he that gathereth not with me scattereth abroad." There are ever to be found those who will sympathize with those who are wrong. Satan had sympathizers in heaven and took large numbers of the angels with him. God and Christ and heavenly angels were on one side, and Satan on the other. Notwithstanding the infinite power and majesty of God and Christ, angels became disaffected. the insinuations of Satan took effect, and they really came to believe that the Father and the Son were their enemies, and that Satan was their benefactor. Satan has the same power and the same control over minds now, only it has increased 100-fold by exercise and experience. Men and women today are deceived, blinded by his insinuations and devices, and know it not. By giving place to doubts and unbelief in regard to the work of God, and by cherishing feelings of distrust and cruel jealousies, they are preparing themselves for complete deception. They rise up with bitter feelings against the ones who dare to speak of their errors and reprove their sins. Those who have, in the fear of God, ventured out to faithfully meet error and sin, calling sin by its right name, have discharged a disagreeable duty with much suffering of feelings to themselves. But they get the sympathy of but few and suffer the neglect of many. The sympathizers are on the wrong side, and they carry out the purposes of Satan to defeat the design of God. Reproofs always hurt human nature. Many are the souls that have been destroyed by the unwise sympathy of their brethren. For because the brethren sympathized with them, they thought they must indeed have been abused, and that the reprover was all wrong and had a bad spirit. The only hope for sinners in Zion is to fully see and confess their wrongs and put them away. Those who step in to destroy the edge of sharp reproof that God sends, saying that the reprover was partly wrong and the reproved was not just right, please the enemy. Any way that Satan can devise to make the reproofs of none effect will accomplish his design. Some will lay blame upon the one whom God has sent with a message of warning, saying, "He is too severe." And in so doing, they become responsible for the soul of the sinner whom God desired to save, and to whom, because he loved them, he sent correction, that he might humble his soul before God and put his sins from him. These false sympathizers will have an account to settle with the Master by and by for their work of death. There are many who profess to believe the truth, who are blind to their own danger. They cherish iniquity in their hearts and practice it in their lives. Their friends cannot read their hearts and frequently think that such are all right. That was taken from Volume 3 of the Testimonies, beginning on page 327 and extending to page 329. Okay, so I'm glad that I was able to read that extra section there, and I hope it was helpful for everyone. If you'll notice at the beginning of this section in Volume 3, where Ellen White points out that sin is not abhorred. And so, I read that and I have to ask myself, do I abhor sin? Now, if we say, oh yes, I abhor sin, and then we find ourselves continuing to sin, if we give in to temptation, I think, at least it seems to me, that that must mean that we don't actually abhor sin. But we can. I mean, I'm not saying that just because we don't now doesn't mean that we should give up and just say, oh, well, I don't abhor sin, so I may as well just not even bother. No, that would be a deception too. But unless we recognize whether we abhor sin or not, we won't even bother trying to have the victory. Or if we have the thought in our minds that a little sin is okay, then again we won't truly abhor sin, because hey, a little bit's okay. So these are things that I have to ask myself. And the other thing that I'm really noticing from this section is how much Ellen is urging us to wake up, to throw off stupidity, as she puts it. You know, that fogginess of mind, that dullness of thinking, that stupidity. And she's reminding us that there is no such thing as a neutral position. You know, and she quotes the words of Christ where he says that, hey, if you're not with me, you're against me. You know, you can't have it both ways. The other thing that I think is really beneficial from this section of the testimony is how she brings out the fact that Satan was able to deceive the angels and cause them to become disaffected themselves. In fact, they were so fully deceived that they came to truly believe that God and his Son were their enemies and that Satan was their benefactor. Now, since then, Satan has manifested his true character, and I'm sure that they all know the truth. Sadly, too late. But hopefully it won't be too late for all of us. And another thing that she brings out here that's really, really important is how we need to be so on guard that we are not sympathizing with people who have received reproof. If we are sympathizing with them because we think, oh, well, you know, that just can't be true of them, that's too harsh, that's too direct or forceful, they don't really, you know, that person doesn't really know the truth about their case. Well, keep in mind that the context of what I'm speaking about here, the context of what Ellen White is speaking about here, are inspired reproofs. So an inspired messenger giving counsel, correction, reproof, rebuke, all those sorts of things. Because we're told in Revelation that those whom God loves, he rebukes and chastens. And God speaks to us through his messengers, the prophets. So that would be the context of this that I'm discussing right now. If someone receives a reproof, as was happening in Ellen White's day, she would, you know, give a counsel or write a rebuke or to someone to correct them. And others would often sympathize with the person who was being corrected. And that is so destructive, because if we think we're right when we're wrong, we won't seek to make amends or to correct our behavior. And if we never correct our behavior and our way of thinking, we will remain in sin, which is remaining in a state that we cannot enter into heaven. You know, Satan was cast out of heaven for bringing sin there, and God is not going to bring sin back into heaven just because Jesus died. You know, that doesn't make any sense. So it's important for us to be awake to the devices of Satan and how deceptive he can be, and also to be on guard to not sympathize with someone, because if we love them, we won't try to make them think they're okay if they're not. And we will allow God to correct them and bring them, or ourselves, you know, maybe that person is me. I would not want somebody sympathizing with me and tempting me to think, hey, yeah, that was a little harsh. There, you know, he's not right about that. That's not what I meant. That's not what I was thinking, or whatever. And then convince myself, yeah, that's just not true. And then I just remain in my sin. No, even though it's not pleasant to our nature, our sinful nature at least, we can learn to love reproof. and I'll hopefully be able to find the proverb that says something along those lines, and it's totally escaping me right now, but I'll provide the scripture reference here for the proverb that says something about a fool hates correction or something like that. So Satan has had a lot more time to become really crafty and good at his deception. So we need to rely completely on the strength of God to give us the victory over every temptation. And we're promised that he can do that. One of the things that also really stands out to me from this testimony in Volume 3, and of course connected with the one in Volume 5, is how we can be completely blind to our great need. And I am so grateful that God has not left us to remain in darkness, but continues to speak to us through his messengers and gives us counsel and reproof so that we can turn from sin and look to him and live. So we'll see you next time going through the remainder of this testimony. And in the meantime, I just pray that you are all very blessed. Shalom.